All right, so, you've got that philosopher's mind, always turning gears, always thinking deep thoughts, right?
Always.
And you've probably spent some time, wrestling with the whole idea of individual responsibility, like what people do and the weight of their choices. But
Of course.
what about when we zoom out a bit? What about when harm isn't just, one person's doing, but like it comes from a whole group,
Yeah,
like a whole bunch of people acting together or even not acting at all? Can we actually say a group, a collective can be responsible?
that's a big question.
It is. It's a really naughty one, and that's exactly what we're going to try to untangle today.
Absolutely.
We're taking a deep dive into this idea of collective responsibility.
Collective responsibility, right?
And our main guidebook for this journey is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay, sounds good.
And, they lay out this idea of collective responsibility as basically having two main parts.
Two parts. Okay.
One is like the straight up cause and effect part,
Mhm.
like the group did something that caused harm in the world. But then there's that second part.
The blame part.
Exactly. The blameworthiness, like how much can we actually blame a group for causing that harm? So it's not just about like who physically did the thing, right?
Right. It gets deeper than that.
It's about the moral weight of it all.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia makes it really clear that we're usually talking about moral responsibility here, not just, the domino effect of one thing leading to another.
Right. So it's got that ethical dimension to it. It's not just neutral cause and effect.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get to like the heart of the difference here. What really separates this idea of collective responsibility from, just plain old individual responsibility?
Good question.
Because it can't just be about the number of people involved, right?
Right. It goes beyond that. The core difference is where the responsibility comes from. See, with individuals, it often comes down to this idea of free will, like a person making a conscious choice to do something.
Right. They had the option to do something else, but they chose this.
Exactly.
Mm.
But with collective responsibility, it's about attributing both that cause and the blame to a whole group based on what they do together.
So it's not necessarily about proving each person in the group made a free will choice.
Not in the same way, at least.
Interesting.
It's a different way of thinking about where the responsibility comes from. It's about what the group does as a unit, not each person's individual little choices.
Okay, so I see the layers already. It's getting complex.
Oh, it definitely gets complex.
So for you listening out there with your philosopher brain ready to go, our mission today is to unpack all this.
We're going to dive in.
We're going to dive into the controversies, the messy bits, the different ways people think about collective responsibility.
Oh, those different angles, yeah.
And we're going to wrestle with those big philosophical questions it brings up, about agency, about what intention even means when we talk about groups, and about, where blame really sits when it's not just one person on the hook.
All those big ideas.
Right. And the Stanford Encyclopedia lays out the battleground right from the start.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely some debate
The
there.
central controversy is like the starting pistol for this whole discussion.
Yeah.
It boils down to this really basic question. Can a group truly be a moral agent, like on its own, separate from the individuals in it?
It makes you question, like, what even is an agent?
Totally. We throw around phrases like, you know, the nation decided or the company pledged to do this all the time.
All the time.
But why is it so tricky to actually think of a group as a moral agent? Like, it has its own will and makes its own choices.
Well, the folks who really push back on this are the methodological individualists and the normative individualists.
Okay. Two flavors of individualism.
Right. And the methodological individualists are like, hold on, does it even make sense to talk about a group having moral agency? Like, they say it's only individuals who truly act and intend and have all those mental things that make an agent an agent.
So they're questioning whether a group can be an agent at all.
Yes, exactly. And then you have the normative individualists, and they're coming at it from more of an ethical angle.
Okay, so they're worried about the moral implications.
Right. They're like, wait a minute, if we start saying groups are responsible, doesn't that undermine individual responsibility and fairness? Because you could end up blaming people for things they didn't personally do or even agree with.
So basically, their big objection is like two sides of the same coin. Groups can't really act like individuals, and it's not fair to blame individuals for what the group does.
Exactly.
And that's a pretty strong argument right off the bat.
It is. They're basically saying a group can't have a single unified will or intentions in the same way a person can.
It's too diffused, too many moving parts.
Right. And on the other side, you have the folks who are pro-collective responsibility, and they're trying to show that it's actually totally possible and can be fair.
So they're trying to prove that a group can be responsible and that it makes sense to blame them sometimes?
right? They're saying, look, collective responsibility, group intentions, collective action, all of that. It's not just some made-up thing. It's real, and it can be applied fairly.
Okay, so we've got our two sides squared off now. And the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up another really helpful way to think about this whole thing.
What's that?
They talk about looking backward and looking forward when it comes to responsibility.
Ah, yeah, that's a good distinction.
Can you walk us through that a bit?
Sure. So they're basically saying there are two main ways to think about collective responsibility based on time.
Okay, past versus future.
Exactly. You've got backward-looking responsibility, which is all about the past.
The stuff that's already happened.
Right. It's about looking at harm that's already been done and trying to figure out who or what caused it, and then who should get the blame. It's like moral accounting for the past.
So like a philosophical detective trying to solve the case of who's morally responsible for something that's already happened.
Exactly. And then you have forward-looking responsibility, and that's all about the future.
Okay, so not dwelling on the past, but looking ahead.
Right. It shifts the focus from blame to obligation. What should a group do to fix existing harm and stop it from happening again? It's about taking action to make things better.
So less about who messed up and more about who cleans up the mess.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the encyclopedia points out that forward-looking responsibility actually tends to be less controversial.
Really? Why is that?
Well, most people can wrap their heads around the idea that a group can have a responsibility to do something in the future. It's like saying, okay, you guys need to work together to fix this.
It's more about action than judgment.
Right. But even though the idea itself might not be as controversial, it still brings up a ton of tricky questions.
Like what?
Well, how do we decide who actually has this responsibility to act? And what are the ethical rules for giving someone that responsibility? It's less about figuring out who's to blame for the past and more about figuring out who's best suited to take charge of the future.
So it's a different kind of ethical puzzle. Okay, so we've got our backward-looking and forward-looking lenses. Now, let's really dig into the controversies here. Starting with backward-looking. What are the big sticking points for philosophers when it comes to blaming groups for past actions?
So the encyclopedia breaks it down into three main areas of disagreement.
3. Okay, lay 'em on me.
The first one, and maybe the trickiest, is the whole concept of whether groups can even be morally responsible at all.
So, like, can we even talk about a group being a moral agent in the first place?
Right. Can they really choose to do things? Can they form intentions as a group and not just as a bunch of individuals with their own separate intentions? And most importantly, can we actually say a group is blameworthy or guilty as a moral agent?
Yeah, that's a big one. If a group doesn't have intentions, can we really hold them morally responsible for the stuff they do?
Right. It's like trying to blame a cloud for raining on your picnic. You can't really say the cloud made a choice to rain on you.
Right, it just did what clouds do.
Exactly. And this idea of collective intentionality, that's a huge point of contention in this whole debate.
So that's like the first battleground. Can a group even have intentions?
Exactly. Now, the second big controversy is all about how we would even distribute blame if we decided a group was responsible.
Okay, so let's say we all agree that, yeah, this group did something wrong and they're to blame as a group.
Right.
But then how do we divvy up that blame amongst all the people in the group?
That's the question. Is it even fair to try to divvy it up? And if it is fair, how do we do it in a way that makes sense? Is it right to blame someone for what their group did, even if they didn't personally do anything wrong, or even if they were against it? And it gets even more complicated when you start thinking about different types of groups.
Right, a club is different from a corporation, which is different from a whole nation.
Exactly. So the conditions for fairly blaming individuals and the types of groups where that even applies those are all up for debate.
It sounds like a real ethical maze to navigate.
Oh, it totally is. You can imagine, like, if a big company does something unethical, are all the employees equally to blame? From the CEO all the way down to the receptionist?
It doesn't feel right to say they're all equally responsible.
Right, and that leads to really deep questions about justice and how we hold individuals accountable when they're part of a group.
So how much does being part of a group affect your own individual responsibility?
Exactly. And then the third big controversy is about whether it's even worthwhile to assign collective responsibility at all.
So this is less about how we do it and more about whether we should even bother.
Right. Critics worry about what it means for individual freedom and justice. They say, wait a minute, if we're focusing on blaming groups, are we letting individuals off the hook? Are we saying it's okay to hide behind the group and not take responsibility for your own actions?
So they're worried it could create a loophole for people to avoid personal accountability.
Exactly. And they also bring up specific cases like war tribunals or paying reparations for historical wrongs. They ask, are we being fair and effective when we assign blame in these situations? Or are we causing more harm than good?
It's a valid concern. We wouldn't want collective responsibility to become an excuse for individual bad behavior.
Definitely not. Now shifting gears to forward-looking responsibility.
Okay, so now we're talking about preventing harm, not just blaming for past harm.
Exactly. And here one of the biggest debates is about how much past actions matter when we're deciding who should be responsible for fixing things.
Okay, so like if a group caused a problem in the past, are they automatically the ones who have to fix it, even if they've changed or don't have the means to fix it anymore?
That's the question. Should the responsibility always fall on the ones who caused the problem? Or should we focus on finding the groups that are actually best equipped to prevent harm in the future, even if they had nothing to do with the original problem?
So it's a tension between who caused it and who can fix it.
Exactly. And then there's another layer to this. What if no group exists that can actually handle the problem?
So like we need a specific group to step up, but they don't exist yet.
Right. Does that create a moral obligation to actually create that group? And if so, what rules should guide that creation? It's a whole other level of complexity.
It's like responsibility on steroids. We're not just blaming or fixing, we're potentially creating the very groups that need to exist to handle the problem.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's clear that both backward-looking and forward-looking responsibility are packed with these philosophical dilemmas.
Oh yeah, they're not easy questions.
And this brings us to the heart of how we make sense of collective responsibility in the first place, this big divide between aggregative and non-distributive views.
Right. Because it would be easy if collective responsibility was just aggregative. Like if it was just adding up all the individual responsibilities and calling it a day.
Right, so like if 10 people each do 10% of the harm, then the group is 100% responsible.
Exactly. But the real philosophical headache comes from trying to figure out if there's something more to it than that. Can there be a truly non-distributive kind of collective responsibility?
Yeah.
Something that's bigger than just the sum of its parts?
So like is a group action just a bunch of individual actions happening at the same time? Or is there something
Okay.
special about the group itself that gives it its own moral weight?
Exactly. And the skeptics, the folks who are like, nah, groups can't really be responsible, they usually fall back on this idea of methodological individualism.
Right, so they're saying it always comes back to the individuals in the group.
Right. They say groups can't form intentions on their own. It's always the individuals in the group who have intentions, and then they act on them. So a group can't really act or cause harm as a group.
So they're saying a group action is just a bunch of individual actions with a group label slapped on it.
Exactly. And they also say that because a group is different from an individual, it can't have the same kind of moral agency that would make it blameworthy.
So you can blame a person for doing something bad, but you can't blame a group for doing something bad.
That's their argument.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions some big names in philosophy who were early supporters of this skeptical view, like Weber and Lewis. What were their main points?
Well, Weber was all about how you can't really separate a true collective action from a bunch of individuals doing the same thing. Like you said, groups just don't have the same ability to think and form intentions that individuals do.
He was skeptical that a group could act as one mind.
Exactly. And then you have Lewis, who was even more hardcore in his skepticism. He straight up called collective responsibility barbarous.
Wow, no mincing words there.
Nope. He believed that only individual people can be truly guilty for what they do. To him, blaming a whole group was like mixing apples and oranges.
So he thought it was a fundamental category mistake to even talk about group guilt.
Exactly. And a lot of philosophers today, even if they don't use such strong language, they still share that underlying skepticism about group intentions.
They still think it all boils down to the individuals.
Right. They question whether a group can really do anything that can't be explained by the actions of the people in it.
So they're still looking for that individual thread in the tapestry of group action.
Exactly. And for these skeptics, a lot hinges on the idea that intentions have to come first.
So like you have to intend to do something before you actually do it.
Right. And they believe that this applies to both individuals and groups. So for them, any real action, whether it's by one person or a whole group, has to start with an intention. And to blame someone, you have to show they had a bad intention.
So they're setting a pretty high bar for proving collective responsibility. You need to prove the group as a whole had a bad intention.
Right. And this emphasis on intention lets them define collective action in a way that requires there to be group-level intentions, which they then say are impossible.
So they're setting up a definition that makes it impossible for collective responsibility to exist.
Exactly. Like the encyclopedia mentions this philosopher J. Angelo Corlett, and he defines collective action as something caused by the beliefs and desires of the collective itself.
So the group itself has to have beliefs and desires, not just the individuals in it.
Right. And of course, the skeptics are like, see, groups can't have those things, so collective action is impossible.
Okay, so that's a pretty solid argument from their side. But what about the philosophers who are like, no, hold on, collective responsibility is a real thing? How do they counter that?
Well, they have a few different strategies.
Yeah.
One really compelling argument is to just point out that we blame groups all the time in everyday life.
So they're appealing to common sense.
Exactly. Like this philosopher, David Cooper, he says we blame corporations, we blame nations, heck, we even blame sports teams.
Right, we say things like, that company is evil or that country is corrupt.
Exactly. And we do it in the same way we blame individuals.
Yeah.
So Cooper's argument is basically like, look, if we're already doing it, maybe there's something to it.
So it's not just some abstract philosophical idea, it's something we actually practice in the real world.
Right. And Deborah Tollefson takes this idea even further. She points out that we have these emotional reactions to groups. Like we feel anger or resentment towards a whole group.
So it's not just a cold, rational judgment, it's also about emotions.
Right. And she argues that those emotions aren't misplaced. Like, we're not wrong to feel angry at a group, because groups can do things that deserve our anger.
So the way we naturally react to groups suggests that they can be morally responsible.
Exactly. Now, of course, just because we commonly do something doesn't mean it's philosophically sound.
Right. We could all be making a mistake.
Exactly. And Cooper acknowledges that. So defenders of collective responsibility also try to show that the blame we put on groups is different from just adding up individual blame.
So it's not just a bunch of individual blame bundled together.
Right. Cooper uses examples like sports clubs or nations, where it seems like the blame really belongs to the group as a whole, even if the specific members change over time.
So, like, if a sports team cheats, it's the team that's blamed, even if some of the players weren't involved.
Exactly. And Peter French adds to this by pointing out that there are some things that only make sense to say about a group and not about individuals.
Like what?
Like you can say a group disbanded or a group elected a president, but those actions don't really have a counterpart for individuals.
Right. You can't say a single person disbanded or a single person elected a president.
Exactly. So this suggests that there are actions and characteristics that are inherently collective.
So there's something unique about groups that can't just be reduced to the actions of the individuals in them.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're starting to build a case for group agency here. But what about the really thorny issue of group intentions and this idea of a group mind?
Yeah, that's a big one. And as you mentioned before, a lot of philosophers are really hesitant to even talk about shared mental states.
It's like, are we saying groups have their own consciousness?
Right. And as the encyclopedia quotes this philosopher Brooks Sadler, he says that even talking about shared intention seems to imply that groups have shared minds.
Which is a pretty controversial idea.
Oh, yeah. And Matthew Badorf takes it even further. He argues that because groups don't have consciousness, they just can't be held accountable.
So it's like back to the cloud analogy. You can't blame a cloud for raining because it doesn't have a mind to make choices.
Exactly. So the skeptics are basically saying no shared consciousness, no real group intentions, no moral agency for groups.
Okay, so how do the defenders of collective responsibility respond to this?
Well, one really important response comes from the work of Michael Bratman.
Okay, tell me about him.
So Bratman developed this really influential theory of shared intention. And his theory doesn't rely on this idea of a unified group mind.
So he's trying to explain shared intention without saying groups have their own consciousness.
Exactly. And he does this by focusing on how individual intentions can be interconnected.
Okay, so it's still about individual intentions, but they're linked together in a specific way.
Right. He talks about how individuals can intend to do something together. They have this mutual support, they develop plans that work together, and they share a common understanding of what they're doing.
So it's like a finely tuned orchestra, each musician playing their own part, but working together to create a unified sound.
That's a great analogy. And Bratman is very careful to say that even though his theory can explain how groups can act together, it doesn't automatically mean they're moral agents.
So just because a group can work towards a shared goal doesn't mean they have a moral compass.
Exactly. Sharing an intention isn't enough to say a group can be blamed for something.
Okay, so how do we get from this idea of shared intention to a group actually being a moral agent that we can hold responsible?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And a lot of defenders of collective responsibility turn to earlier thinkers for inspiration, folks like Durkheim, Simmel, and Sartre.
Okay, so they're looking back at some classic sociological and philosophical ideas.
Exactly. And one really interesting approach comes from Margaret Gilbert, who builds on Durkheim's ideas about social facts.
Mm.
She's got this thing she calls the plural subject account.
Okay, plural subject. What's that all about?
So she argues that group intentions come from these joint commitments that individuals make to act as a single body.
So it's like they're all signing a contract to act together as one unit.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And David Velleman, he adds to this by really emphasizing the unity of this plural subject. He sees it as multiple individuals coming together to form one single agent, even though it's a plural agent.
So it's like Voltron, multiple robots combining to form one giant super robot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the argument here is that this plural subject, this combined entity, is the thing that can be morally responsible for the group's actions.
Okay, so we've got our potential candidate for a group level moral agent, but the encyclopedia points out a really important question. Does this plural subject actually have the qualities that would make it a moral subject?
Right. Can it understand right and wrong? Can it be blamed for doing something bad?
And Raimo Tuomola, he offers another perspective. He talks about these we intentions, and he
Mm.
argues that when a group acts intentionally, it's because the individuals in the group are acting intentionally. So the individual intentions are like the building blocks for the group intention.
Exactly. And he even uses this idea of a representative subject, which kind of reminds you of Hobbes's Leviathan.
Oh, yeah, the big, powerful sovereign representing the will of the people.
Exactly. So it's like the group forms this unified will that's represented by this subject.
Okay, so we're getting closer to understanding how a group can act with intention. But Larry May, he comes at it from a different angle, right?
Yes, May is not a big fan of those traditional Kantian ideas about individual agency, where it's all about individuals making rational choices.
So he's challenging that classic individualistic view.
Exactly. And he proposes this idea of a pre-reflective intention.
Okay, pre-reflective, what does that even mean?
So he's saying these intentions don't come from a single person sitting there consciously thinking things through. They come from the whole web of relationships within the group.
So it's like the intention emerges from the group's interactions, not from any one person's mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even though these intentions might not be totally separate from the individuals in the group, May argues that they're fundamentally group-based. They're shaped and caused by the way the group is structured.
So the group structure itself is like a breeding ground for these pre-reflective intentions. Okay, so we've explored all these different ways of thinking about how groups can form intentions. But the ultimate challenge seems to be figuring out if a group can actually be morally blameworthy.
Right. Can we actually say a group is guilty of something in a moral sense?
And Christian List and Philip Pettit, they take this head on.
Right. They do. They argue that groups can be moral agents if they have certain qualities.
Okay, so like a checklist for moral agency?
Right. They say a group needs to have beliefs about the world, desires and values, and the ability to process all of that and then make decisions based on it.
So they need to be able to think, feel, and act in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And they go further and say that for a group to be morally blameworthy for a specific action, 3 conditions need to be met.
Okay, 3 conditions. What are they?
First, the action has to be a grave matter. Like it has to be something seriously wrong.
Okay, so no blaming a group for accidentally spilling coffee.
Right. Second, the group has to have full knowledge of guilt. Like they knew what they were doing was wrong.
So no claiming ignorance.
And third, there has to be full consent of the will on the part of the group.
Okay, so this is where it gets really tricky. How can a whole group have a unified will and consent to something?
That's the big question.
Mm.
And the encyclopedia points out that while List and Pettit make a good case for the first 2 conditions, the third one is a lot harder to pin down.
Right, it's one thing for a group to know something's wrong, but it's another thing for them to all agree to do it anyway.
Exactly. And even though they say it's crucial to understand how groups control their actions, they don't really go into detail about how that works.
Okay, so there's still some work to be done on that front, but other philosophers have tried to tackle this issue of group control, haven't they?
They have. The encyclopedia mentions Kendi Hess and Kenneth Silver.
Okay, what are their takes?
So Hess argues that groups have free will and therefore moral responsibility to the extent that their actions come from their own unique motivations and are guided by these things she calls reasons responsive mechanisms.
So she's saying groups have their own internal reasons for acting, and they can respond to reasons in a way that makes them accountable.
Exactly. And Silver, he doubles down on this reasons responsive approach. He says that what makes a group responsible is their ability to come up with reasons for acting and then actually act on those reasons.
So it's not about free will in the traditional sense, it's about being able to think rationally and morally as a group.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone deep on intentions and control, but now let's talk about the structure of groups themselves. Because not all groups are created equal, right?
Right. Some groups are more organized than others.
Exactly. So how does the Stanford Encyclopedia help us figure out which groups we can actually hold responsible?
They talk about this common distinction between aggregate and conglomerate collectivities, which comes from the work of Peter French.
Okay, aggregate versus conglomerate. Break it down for me.
An aggregate is basically just a random bunch of people with no real structure or shared purpose.
So like a crowd of people waiting for the bus.
Exactly. And those types of groups are usually not seen as appropriate for collective responsibility.
Right, you wouldn't blame the whole crowd if one person pushes someone.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now, a conglomerate is different. It's a more organized group with its own identity and a way of making decisions that's more than just the sum of its parts.
So like a company or a government.
Exactly. And these more structured groups are usually seen as better candidates for collective responsibility.
Because they have a clear way of acting as a unit.
Right. French says these conglomerate groups have three main features. They have ways of deciding what to do as a group, they have rules that govern their behavior, and they have defined roles for members.
So everyone knows their place and how the group works.
Exactly. And beyond those formally organized groups, you also have groups with shared interests or needs, like ethnic communities or social movements.
So they have a reason to be a group.
Right. And they often have a sense of solidarity where people care about each other and their shared goals.
Right, they're not just a random collection of individuals.
And even shared attitudes, like the attitudes that underlie racism or sexism, have been suggested as a basis for collective responsibility, although that's definitely more controversial.
So it's not just about formal structures, it can also be about shared beliefs or values.
Right. But what about those less structured groups? The encyclopedia brings up these interesting cases of random collections of individuals and mobs.
Yeah, like what if a bunch of strangers just happen to be in the same place at the same time? Can we hold them responsible for something that happens?
That's a tough one. Virginia Held argues that even these seemingly unorganized groups can have a kind of responsibility for not acting if they could have prevented harm together.
So like the bystander effect.
Exactly. Like if a bunch of people see someone getting mugged and they all just stand there and watch, Held would say they share the same responsibility for not stepping in.
So even though they're not a formal group, their inaction makes them collectively responsible.
That's her argument. But Stanley Bates, he pushes back on this. He says that even these seemingly random groups might be able to communicate and coordinate more than Held gives them credit for.
So maybe they're not as powerless as they seem.
Right. And then you have mobs, which are kind of the opposite of organized.
Right, they're chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even in these situations, May and Tuamala argue that collective responsibility can pop up if individuals are contributing to the harm while acting as part of the mob.
So even if there's no leader or plan, if you're part of a mob and you're doing things that hurt people, you can still share in the blame.
Exactly. Tuamala says that, like, in a riot, people might be smashing windows and looting without anyone explicitly telling them to do it, but they're still acting as part of the collective action of the riot.
So their individual actions contribute to the overall harm caused by the mob.
Exactly.
Okay, so even without formal structures, if you're acting in a way that helps a group cause harm, you might be on the hook for some collective responsibility.
Right. Now, what about when a group doesn't do something they should have done? Can they be blamed for their inaction?
Like a group failing to prevent something bad from happening.
Exactly. Joseph Metz talks about this. He says it's hard to say exactly how much each individual contributed to a group's omission, but we can still look at the group's overall ability to act.
So like if a group had the power to stop something bad from happening but they didn't, they might be collectively responsible.
Right. Like he uses the example of climate change. If a group of nations has the resources and power to address it, but they don't do enough, they might be collectively responsible for the consequences.
It's like collective negligence.
Exactly. But the key here is that there needs to be a moral expectation for the group to act in the first place.
Right, they have to have a duty to do something.
Exactly. And David Kopp talks about this. He says it's easier to justify these collective obligations for organized groups with clear goals and commitments.
Right, like a government has a duty to protect its citizens.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But it gets trickier for those less structured groups. Like, when do a bunch of random individuals have a collective obligation to do something?
That's where things get fuzzy.
Yeah. Now, what about responsibility for past actions? Like, can we blame a current group for what their predecessors did?
Yeah, like the whole debate about reparations for slavery.
Exactly.
Mm.
That's a really sensitive and controversial issue. Janet Thompson points out that it feels wrong to blame individuals for something that happened before they were even born.
Right, how can you be responsible for something you had no part in?
Exactly. But Fareed Abdel Noor suggests that maybe a sense of community and shared history can create a basis for responsibility.
So, like, if you benefit from past injustices, maybe you have a responsibility to help make things right.
Right. But Michael Bratman, he emphasizes that for a group to be responsible over time, there needs to be some kind of ongoing interaction and shared intention.
So it's not just about being connected to the past, it's about actively continuing the actions or benefiting from them.
Right. And Linda Radzik and Larry May, they both argue that just benefiting from past injustice isn't the same as causing it.
Right. Just because you inherit a privilege doesn't mean you're guilty of creating that privilege.
Exactly.
Mm.
But Thompson suggests that benefiting from past harm might create a different kind of obligation, like an obligation to deal with the ongoing effects of that harm.
So it's a more nuanced kind of responsibility.
Right. And the encyclopedia points out that some collective entities like states or corporations might be more suitable for this kind of responsibility because they have structures and identities that persist over time.
So they're not just a collection of individuals, they're entities that continue to exist even as their members change.
Exactly. And Maeve McKeown argues that this is why states can be held liable for reparations.
Because they're seen as the same entity that committed the harm, even if the individual people in the government have changed.
Exactly. And Thompson suggests that we can evaluate these long-lasting entities as if they were moral agents that continue through time.
So it's like we're treating them as if they have a moral lifespan that extends beyond the lifespan of their individual members.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like when we're dealing with responsibility for past actions, a lot depends on the nature of the group and how they've continued to exist and act over time.
Right. And how the present generation is connected to those past actions.
Exactly. Now let's move into this question of distributing collective responsibility among the individuals in a group. What's the key difference between collective responsibility and shared responsibility?
So collective responsibility is about the responsibility of the group as a whole.
Like the group itself is the one we're blaming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And shared responsibility is about how much each individual in the group is responsible for the harm the group caused.
So it's about how the group's responsibility trickles down to the individuals.
Exactly. And while philosophers are careful to keep these two levels of responsibility separate, they often try to figure out